March 4th, 1942. 01:30 hours, Saint-Nazaire, occupied France. HMS Campbelltown struck the massive dry dock gates at 17 knots, her bow packed with 4 tons of delayed action explosives. The impact threw Royal Marine Commandos forward on her deck. Before the destroyer had fully settled, they were already moving, leaping onto French soil, weapons ready, green berets marking them in the darkness. German Lieutenant Klaus Weber stared through his binoculars from the harbour defence post, trying to understand what he was seeing. The destroyer had just rammed the gates, an insane attack that made no tactical sense. Now figures were pouring from the wreck, moving with practiced efficiency through the chaos of searchlights and tracer fire. Then he saw it, the distinctive green berets, just visible in the glare. His stomach dropped. "Commandos," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Then louder, to the men around him. "It's the British Commandos. Sound the alarm. Get every man to the walls." One of his sergeants, a veteran from Poland and France, crossed himself. "God help us." The commandos were already at work. Explosions erupted across the dock facility as demolition teams hit their targets, pumping stations, winding houses, lock gates. Weber's machine gun positions opened fire, but the British troops didn't scatter like regular infantry. They advanced through the fire, returning shots with precision, moving as if they'd rehearsed this exact assault 100 times, which, Weber realized with growing dread, they probably had. A motor launch exploded in the harbour, hit by German shore batteries. Another burned, men leaping from the flames into oil-slicked water. But the commandos who'd made it ashore kept moving, kept fighting. Weber watched one team assault his neighbouring position. 3 men, outnumbered 5-1, attacking with grenades and automatic fire. The German position fell in under a minute. He'd fought at Dunkirk. He'd seen the British retreat, had believed they were beaten. But these troops, these green berets storming through his defences, were nothing like the exhausted infantry he'd faced in France. These were different, elite, professional, terrifyingly effective. Another explosion shook the dock, then another. The commandos were systematically destroying everything of value, and Weber's garrison, despite outnumbering the attackers 8-1, was barely slowing them down. The commandos leaped from the destroyer onto French soil, immediately engaging German defenders in close-quarters combat. Other commandos landed from motor launches, many of which were destroyed by German fire before reaching shore. The survivors formed into small teams and moved toward their objectives: destroy pumping stations, wreck lock gates, demolish machinery critical to dock operations. They fought through German positions with practiced efficiency, completing demolitions while under fire, systematically destroying everything they'd been assigned to destroy. The withdrawal was chaos. Most motor launches had been sunk or damaged. Commandos fought toward alternative escape routes, but many were cut off by German reinforcements. Some continued fighting until killed or captured. Others went to ground, hoping to evade and escape through occupied France. Of the 611 men who'd participated in the raid, only 228 returned to Britain. The rest were killed or captured, a casualty rate that would have been considered disastrous failure for most operations. But the mission succeeded. The delayed charges on Campbelltown detonated at noon on March 28th, completely destroying the dock gates and killing approximately 300 German personnel who were examining the wreck. The dock facilities were wrecked beyond repair. Saint-Nazaire's dry dock, one of only 2 on Atlantic coast capable of servicing Germany's largest warships, was rendered unusable for the remainder of the war. The raid accomplished its strategic objective at terrible cost, demonstrating that Royal Marine Commandos would execute missions that other forces wouldn't attempt and achieve results that conventional operations couldn't accomplish. The birth of elite force. The Royal Marines' transformation from naval infantry to feared commando force began with Britain's strategic situation after Dunkirk in 1940. The evacuation from France had saved most of the British Expeditionary Forces personnel, but abandoned nearly all their heavy equipment. Britain lacked capacity for major ground operations in Europe, but needed to maintain offensive pressure on German forces, to demonstrate continued resistance, to force Germany to garrison coastlines rather than concentrating forces elsewhere. Winston Churchill, seeking ways to take the fight to occupied Europe despite limited resources, advocated for raiding forces that could strike coastal targets and withdraw before German forces could respond in strength. The Royal Marines were a logical choice for this role. They'd historically served as naval infantry, providing shipboard security, conducting small-scale amphibious operations, operating in contexts where sea and land warfare intersected, but they'd never been organized or trained as elite raiding force. That transformation began in 1940 with establishment of combined operations and formation of commando units. The commandos, initially drawn from Army volunteers but eventually including Royal Marines units, were designed to be something different from regular infantry. Selection standards were higher, emphasizing physical fitness, mental toughness, and initiative. Training was deliberately harder than regular military training, designed to identify and develop men who could operate under extreme stress. The objective was creating small units of exceptional soldiers who could accomplish missions through superior skill, determination, and aggression, rather than through numerical superiority or heavy firepower. Royal Marines, who volunteered for commando service, underwent training at Achnacarry in Scotland, a facility that became legendary for its difficulty. The training emphasized physical conditioning, forced marches over mountainous terrain carrying full equipment, obstacle courses run at speed, swimming in cold water, endless repetitions of basic military skills until they became automatic even under extreme fatigue. But it also emphasized mental resilience, operating effectively despite exhaustion, maintaining discipline under fire, refusing to quit regardless of circumstances. The casualty rate during training was significant. Not deaths, but dismissals of men who couldn't maintain standards. Perhaps 30% of volunteers were returned to regular units as unsuitable for commando service. Those who completed training emerged as genuinely elite soldiers, physically tougher and mentally harder than regular infantry, conditioned to standards that would serve them in operations where conventional forces would fail. The Royal Marine Commandos adopted distinctive insignia and practices that marked them as special. The green beret became their signature headgear, instantly recognizable and eventually feared by German forces. Their organization into compact, flexible units allowed rapid deployment and independent operation. Their ethos emphasized individual initiative within disciplined framework. Commandos were expected to think and adapt rather than simply following orders, to accomplish mission objectives through whatever means circumstances required. The early raids. The commandos' first operations demonstrated capabilities that exceeded what conventional forces could achieve, but also revealed the high costs of raiding warfare. The Lofoten Islands raid in March 1941 was early success that established template for future operations. 500 commandos landed on Norwegian islands, destroyed fish oil factories, producing glycerin for German explosives, sank shipping, captured German personnel for intelligence, and withdrew with minimal casualties. The raid lasted less than 24 hours, but destroyed facilities worth millions of pounds and forced Germany to garrison Norwegian coast with troops that might otherwise have been deployed elsewhere. German response to Lofoten revealed their concern about raiding threats. Coastal defenses throughout occupied Europe were strengthened. Garrison forces were increased. Hitler personally became obsessed with defending occupied coasts, eventually deploying hundreds of thousands of troops to static defense duties where raiding forces could strike them, but where they couldn't contribute to offensive operations on Eastern Front or elsewhere. The Vagso raid in December 1941 was more costly but equally successful. Commandos assaulted Norwegian port facility, destroyed fish oil factories and shipping, killed approximately 150 German defenders, and captured nearly 100 prisoners. British casualties were significant: 20 killed and 57 wounded from force of approximately 500. But the raid achieved all objectives and demonstrated that commandos could fight effectively against determined German defense. These operations established pattern: small British forces attacking specific targets, inflicting damage disproportionate to their size, withdrawing before German reinforcements could arrive. The raids weren't militarily decisive in themselves, but forced Germany to divert substantial resources to coastal defense, demonstrated British offensive capacity after Dunkirk's disaster, and provided training and experience for larger amphibious operations that would come later. German assessment of these raids combined professional respect with growing concern. British commandos were clearly well-trained and determined opponents who fought with unusual aggression. Their willingness to accept high casualties to achieve objectives suggested fanaticism that regular German infantry didn't expect from British forces. Intelligence reports described commandos as special troops requiring special defensive measures, acknowledgement that they represented different level of threat than regular British units. Dieppe and its lessons. The Dieppe raid in August 1942 was disaster for most Allied units involved, but demonstrated Royal Marines' capability to function effectively even in failed operations. The raid's objective was testing amphibious assault techniques against heavily defended port, gathering intelligence, and destroying facilities. Approximately 6,000 troops, primarily Canadian infantry, with British commandos and small numbers of American and Free French forces, assaulted Dieppe's beaches. German defenders, alerted by preliminary actions, were ready. The Canadians suffered catastrophic casualties, over 3,000 killed, wounded, or captured from 5,000 engaged. The operation was clear failure, achieving few objectives at tremendous cost. But Royal Marine Commandos performed differently. Number 4. Commando, assigning to destroy coastal battery east of Dieppe, landed successfully, fought through German positions, destroyed their objective, and withdrew with relatively light casualties. Their success stood in stark contrast to disasters elsewhere on Dieppe's beaches, demonstrating that even in failed operations, well-trained troops executing realistic missions could achieve results. The German defense at Dieppe was effective and professional, but defenders noted differences between Canadian infantry and British commandos. The Canadians fought bravely, but were clearly conventional infantry attempting assault mission beyond their training and support. The commandos moved and fought differently, with tactical sophistication and aggression that marked them as specialized troops operating at different standard than regular forces. Post-battle German reports included specific references to commandos, noting their capability and recommending enhanced defensive measures at any location where they might operate. The distinction was significant. German forces respected Canadian courage, but feared commando competence, recognizing that these British troops represented different order of threat requiring different defensive approach. The Mediterranean Campaign Royal Marines participated in major amphibious operations across Mediterranean theater, building reputation through sustained combat performance rather than single dramatic actions. In Sicily in July 1943, commandos landed ahead of main invasion force, securing key terrain and disrupting Italian and German defensive preparations. Their operations demonstrated that raiding techniques could scale to major operations, that small, highly capable units could achieve effects disproportionate to their size when properly employed. At Salerno in September 1943, commandos again led assaults, landing under heavy fire and fighting through prepared German defenses. The battle was hard. German forces under Field Marshal Kesselring fought skillfully and nearly drove Allied forces back into the sea. But the commandos held positions despite casualties and German counterattacks, providing anchor points that allowed conventional forces to expand beachhead. German defenders at Salerno recognized commandos by their tactics and demeanor. Prisoners reported that German infantry had been warned about British special troops who fought more aggressively than regular forces, who wouldn't surrender even when surrounded, who required maximum defensive effort to contain. The warnings reflected accumulated experience across multiple operations. German forces had learned that underestimating commandos was dangerous. The Anzio landings in January 1944 saw commandos operating in complex tactical environment where their skills proved essential. The operation involved landing behind German lines to outflank defensive positions, requiring rapid advance inland despite limited forces and uncertain support. Commandos led the advance, moving faster and fighting more effectively than conventional units, though the overall operation became bogged down in sustained combat that lasted months. Through these operations, German forces developed clear understanding of Royal Marines as qualitatively superior troops. Intelligence assessments ranked them among most capable Allied units, recommending that any position likely to face commando assault should receive reinforcement and additional defensive preparation. The assessments weren't propaganda or fear-mongering, but practical recognition that these British troops fought at standard, exceeding regular Allied infantry. Normandy, the test of fire. D-Day on June 6, 1944, represented the ultimate test of Royal Marine Commandos' capabilities, leading amphibious assaults against Germany's most heavily defended coastline. Multiple commando units participated in Normandy landings, each assigned critical objectives that required seizing before conventional forces could advance. Number 41 and 48 Commandos landed at Sword Beach, tasked with advancing inland to link with British airborne forces holding bridges over the Caen Canal and Orne River. The mission required rapid movement through German defenses, covering several miles while under fire, reaching objectives before German reinforcements could overwhelm the airborne troops. The assault was brutal. Commandos landed under heavy fire from German positions that had survived preliminary bombardment. Many were hit in the water or on the beach before reaching cover. Officers and NCOs were targeted by German snipers who recognized leadership by their behavior. Equipment was lost, communications disrupted, casualties mounted. But the commandos continued advancing, moving through gaps in German defenses, bypassing strong points that would have stopped conventional infantry, maintaining momentum despite losses. German defenders recognized commandos immediately. By their aggressive tactics, their refusal to take cover when regular troops would have gone to ground, their systematic destruction of defensive positions. Wehrmacht troops who'd fought on Eastern Front later commented that commandos fought with intensity comparable to Soviet assault troops, but with tactical sophistication Soviet forces typically lacked. The combination was difficult to counter. troops who attacked with near-suicidal aggression but employed intelligent tactics that exploited defensive weaknesses. By day's end, commandos had achieved most objectives despite heavy casualties. Number 41. Commando linked with airborne forces, securing vital bridges. Number 48. Commando secured flanking positions that protected beachhead from German counterattack. Other commando units cleared defensive positions, established communication routes, performed missions that conventional forces would have required days to accomplish if they could accomplish them at all. German casualties in sectors facing commandos were disproportionately high, not because commandos had superior firepower, but because they pressed attacks that regular troops wouldn't have sustained, accepted casualties that conventional units would have considered prohibitive, maintained offensive momentum that gave defenders no opportunity to reorganize. The German forces fought well and inflicted heavy losses, but they were overwhelmed by opponents who simply wouldn't stop. Walcheren and the final campaigns. The assault on Walcheren Island in November 1944 represented perhaps the most difficult commando operation of the war. Amphibious assault on flooded, heavily defended island required to open port of Antwerp to Allied shipping. German forces had flooded Walcheren by destroying dikes, creating environment where assaulting troops had to advance through water ranging from ankle-deep to over their heads, while under fire from prepared positions. The defensive advantages were enormous. Attackers were slowed by water, exposed to fire with minimal cover, unable to employ normal infantry tactics. Conventional wisdom suggested the position was nearly impregnable against assault. Royal Marine commandos attacked regardless. Landing from small boats, they waded through flooded fields, while German machine guns and artillery fired on them. Many drowned when weighted down by equipment in deep water. Others were hit and fell, their bodies disappearing in muddy water. The survivors pressed forward, reaching German positions and engaging in close combat, systematically clearing bunkers and trenches despite conditions that would have stopped conventional troops immediately. The battle lasted several days and cost heavy casualties, approximately 200 killed from force of approximately 2,500 commandos. But it succeeded. German defenders, many of them experienced Eastern Front veterans, were overwhelmed by troops who fought through conditions that should have been impossible. After the battle, German prisoners expressed genuine shock at British determination, stating they'd never expected troops to continue attacking through such terrible conditions. The success at Walcheren opened Antwerp, allowing supplies to reach Allied forces advancing into Germany and shortening supply lines that had been stretched dangerously thin. The strategic impact was substantial. Historians generally consider opening Antwerp as critical enabler for final Allied offensive into Germany. That strategic success was purchased with commando blood and determination that forced victory from circumstances where victory seemed impossible. Through the final months of war, Royal Marine Commandos continued operations into Germany itself, crossing Rhine, clearing German resistance in northwestern Germany, conducting operations that combined conventional combat with special operations as circumstances required. By war's end, they'd participated in virtually every major British amphibious operation and numerous smaller actions, accumulating combat record that few military units could match. The German perspective. German military assessments of Royal Marines evolved from initial confusion about British raiding forces to grudging respect and eventually something approaching fear. Early reports from 1940 and 1941 described commando raids with professional detachment, noting British capability but treating them as limited irritants rather than serious threats. But as raids continued and expanded, German assessments shifted. Intelligence officers recognized that British commandos weren't improvised forces, but purpose-built units whose training and equipment reflected serious commitment to raiding warfare. By 1942, German coastal defense doctrine explicitly included provisions for defending against commando raids. Units stationed in Norway, France, and Channel Islands received training focused on responding to amphibious assaults by elite forces. Defensive positions were designed to provide mutual support against small, highly mobile attackers. Communication systems were established to summon reinforcements rapidly when raids occurred. The doctrinal changes reflected recognition that commandos represented specialized threat requiring specialized countermeasures. Individual German soldiers' accounts reveal more visceral responses. Letters and diaries captured after battles include references to British troops who fought like madmen, who refused to surrender even when defeated, who advanced through fire that should have stopped them. These descriptions capture something beyond professional respect. They reflect genuine fear of opponents who wouldn't behave according to normal military expectations about when troops would break and run. Hitler's infamous Commando Order of October 1942 directed that captured commandos should be executed rather than treated as prisoners of war, ostensibly because they employed unsoldierly tactics, but actually reflecting German High Command's concern about their psychological impact. The order was partially enforced. Some captured commandos were executed, others were treated as regular POWs, but its existence demonstrated that German leadership considered commandos as exceptional threat, warranting exceptional measures. Lower-level German commanders generally didn't support the commando order, recognizing that executing prisoners violated military conventions and would invite retaliation against German prisoners. But they did take commando threats seriously, requesting additional resources for defending positions where attacks might occur, emphasizing in reports that commando operations required responses beyond what regular Allied troops necessitated. The calculation, whether Royal Marines' contribution justified their costs, requires assessing both what they achieved and what alternatives might have accomplished. The commandos successfully executed missions that conventional forces couldn't have attempted. Their raids forced German military to allocate substantial resources to coastal defense that might otherwise have been employed offensively. Their performance in major operations like Normandy and Walcheren achieved objectives critical to overall Allied strategy. These contributions were real and valuable, but they came at tremendous human cost. The casualties, killed, wounded, psychologically damaged, represented permanent loss of exceptional soldiers who might have contributed differently if employed less destructively. The question of whether creating small elite force, accepting extreme casualties, was better than distributing those soldiers throughout regular units to raise overall capability has no definitive answer. The strategic calculation also involves considering alternatives. Would conventional forces with better support and preparation have achieved similar results with lower casualties? Would avoiding high-risk operations and accepting longer timelines have served Britain's interests better? These counterfactual questions can't be answered definitively, but they must be considered when assessing commandos' contribution. What's clear is that German fear of Royal Marines was earned through actual capability and demonstrated willingness to accept costs that conventional forces wouldn't bear. That fear was a tool that British command employed to achieve strategic objectives, forcing defensive responses, accomplishing missions, demonstrating offensive capacity after Dunkirk's disaster. Whether the tool was worth its cost is judgment about values and priorities rather than simple military calculation. The Royal Marines who served as commandos paid the price regardless of whether strategic employment was optimal. They volunteered or were volunteered, trained beyond normal military standards, fought with courage and skill that earned professional respect from enemies and allies alike, and died or were damaged in proportions that regular troops would have considered catastrophic. Their contribution to victory was substantial. The cost of that contribution was borne primarily by them and their families, making them simultaneously victors and victims of strategy that employed them with brutal effectiveness. The Green Beret became symbol of British military excellence, representing selection and training and combat performance that few could match. But it also represented casualty rates and psychological burden and human cost that made that excellence possible. German forces learned to fear the Green Beret because it marked troops who'd proven through sustained combat that they were genuinely exceptional and genuinely dangerous. That fear was tribute to commandos' capability, acknowledgement of price they'd paid to achieve it, and recognition that fighting such opponents required more than conventional military responses could provide.